Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time. Today, we are undertaking a very necessary and deep dive into Timothy Snyder's monumental and deeply challenging work, Bloodlands, Europe, Between Hitler and Stalin. This deep dive is customized for you, focusing on the institutional and administrative mechanics of mass catastrophe in the heart of Europe. We're confronting the darkest systems of the 20th century.
And the core question Snyder forces us to confront is just profound. What happens when two violently ideological expansionist regimes, National Socialism and Soviet Communism, collide? And, how do their respective systems of governance translate these utopian visions into systematic, large-scale mass murder?
Right.
We're talking about the complete bureaucratic inversion of morality.
It is so easy for us to generalize the casualties of the Second World War into these abstract statistics. But Snyder forces us to zoom in on a specific geography and ask how. How did the institutional mechanisms produce these catastrophes? And why this topic matters now is, I think, quite simple. Understanding administrative violence, the intentional starvation, the bureaucratic extermination, the systemic hatred, it's essential for recognizing these persistent patterns of state violence.
And for resisting the simple, often partisan explanations of history.
Exactly. The ones that minimize the complexity of these twin tyrannies.
Exactly. Our mission today is purely a systems-level analysis. We are not focusing on assigning individual moral blame. We're trying to explain the structures, the policies, and the devastating feedback loops that resulted in the catastrophic murder of approximately 14 million non-combatant civilians, all within the specific territories Snyder defines as the Bloodlands.
We need to understand the logic.
However horrifying that logic is.
Okay, so to set the stage, we really need to understand the author and the context of this work.
We do. First, Timothy Snyder. He's a prominent historian, highly regarded for his ability to synthesize these incredibly complex, multilingual primary sources from Central and Eastern Europe. His work often seeks to view the history of Europe between Hitler and Stalin, and in doing so, he frequently challenges the established historical taboos that had, for decades, really divided the memory of the continent.
And the context of the book's writing is just crucial to appreciating its impact. Bloodlands was published in 2010. It fundamentally responds to these fragmented memories and historical silences that came out of the Cold War.
Yes. For so long, the suffering caused by the Soviets was, politically minimized in the West. And conversely, the extent of Nazi atrocities in the East, particularly what's now known as the Holocaust by bullets, was often misunderstood outside the region where it actually happened.
So Snyder is trying to present a unified history of mass killing where these two regimes overlapped.
He's forcing a necessary and very uncomfortable comparison. And this challenge of establishing a singular historical factuality, especially when the facts themselves were politically determined or suppressed by these regimes.
Right.
It's something the political theorist Hannah Arendt explored much earlier. Snyder is grappling with the legacy of a world where truth was, essentially, whatever the state said it was.
So let's just cut to the central thesis. Let's make it perfectly clear for you, the listener. Between 1933 and 1945, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union murdered approximately 14 million non-combatant civilians in a specific overlapping region of Eastern Europe. This region is known as the Bloodlands, and the killing was done through deliberate bureaucratic policies.
And we had to define that region very clearly because the geography is absolutely critical to the story.
It's not Germany or Russia.
No, it is not Germany or Russia proper. The Bloodlands are the territories, often borderlands, that were subject to both German and Soviet police power and their killing policies at some point during that 12-year period.
So geographically, we're talking about
a region that corresponds very closely to modern Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, and Latvia. This region endured double occupation, double ideological terror. It became the world's central killing ground.
And this is where Snyder challenges are really critical perception, especially for listeners in the West who grew up with the imagery of concentration camps liberated by American or British forces.
That's right. The book corrects this common, deeply ingrained perception that mass killing was centered only on camps like Auschwitz or Dachau.
That image, as powerful as it is,
It represents only a fraction of the deaths. It's a dark historical mirage that has obscured the true geography of the murder. Auschwitz is, of course, the most familiar name, but as Snyder emphasizes, it was primarily a vast labor camp complex with a killing facility attached.
a hybrid.
A hybrid, exactly. The people processed and registered as laborers there had a small but real chance of surviving, which is exactly why we have So many deeply personal memoirs from that specific location.
That distinction is so important. It explains why our collective memory focuses on Auschwitz. If there are survivors, there are stories.
Mhm.
But where did the majority of those 14 million non-combatants die?
The vast majority of the Holocaust victims, especially Polish, Soviet, and Baltic Jews, were killed in two main ways. First, they were gassed in these less-recalled death factories, places like Treblinka, Chemno, Sobibor, and Bezek.
These weren't labor camps.
Not at all. They were designed solely for rapid industrial-scale death, where almost everyone died within hours of arrival.
And the second way.
The second way, and this accounts for even more victims, is that they were simply shot over ditches and pits near where they lived. This was particularly true in occupied Soviet territories like Ukraine and Belarus.
So the key distinction is, Auschwitz was a place of slow, dehumanizing labor, designed to extract maximum use before death. But Treblinka was purely a killing facility designed for rapid disposal, leaving virtually no witnesses.
Exactly. And because the SS systematically dismantled and attempted to erase places like Treblinka and Belarus, and because the Western Allies liberated none of the critical death facilities or even reached the Bloodlands themselves.
That history remains in the shadows.
It does. The Red Army liberated Auschwitz and the sites of the fixed death factories. This geographical accident fundamentally shaped what the post-war world chose to remember,
Focusing on the labor camps.
and obscuring the true scope of the killing further east.
Okay, let's unpack this and dive into the key insights Snyder develops, starting with a necessary chronological correction about which system was initially the most lethal.
Yes. Key insight number one. The killing preceded the Holocaust, from 1933 to 1938. This is a point that often gets lost in the focus on World War II. Before the war even began, the Soviet system was demonstrably far more lethal than the Nazi system, and its violence was intrinsically linked to state economic policy.
To the pursuit of what they called socialist autarky, we are talking about the Soviet Great Famine in Ukraine, the Holodomor, which peaked between 32 and 33. The source material shows this catastrophe claimed over 3 million lives through purposeful administrative policies. It makes it clear this was not some accident of nature or poor crop yields.
No.
It was enforced political starvation.
It was bureaucratic murder by starvation. The system of collectivization, this forced merging of private farms into state-owned operations, had effectively created a second serfdom.
Right.
And when the yields dropped below the fantastical targets set by Moscow, Stalin and his deputies, people like Kaganovich, they insisted the requisition targets must be met.
And the administrative tools were lethal?
Absolutely. Policies required peasants to return grain advances, sometimes even seizing their seed grain. Party brigades were sent out to enforce these orders, even in places that had already produced poor yields.
What's so chilling is the calculated nature of the death. The decisions weren't made out of necessity, were they? They were made to fulfill an ideological plan.
Precisely. A simple bureaucratic decision, just a respite from requisitions for 3 months, would have saved most of those 3 million lives. But Stalin insisted the state fight ferociously against the peasants, who he framed as withholding grain as part of a class struggle by the kulak.
The perceived wealthy peasant class.
Exactly. This was a conscious choice to prioritize state ideology and industrialization over the lives of millions of its own citizens.
And this systemic violence, it didn't end with the famine. It immediately transformed into the Great Terror from 37 to 38. And this is where the killing becomes administrative, purposeful mass murder governed by quotas.
Absolutely. The Great Terror involved the documented execution of nearly 700,000 Soviet citizens, and the sheer brutality of it was organized by numerical quotas issued directly from Moscow. For instance, the infamous Order 00447, which targeted over 272,000 people for shooting, or the Gulag.
So local NKVD units, the secret police, they were compelled to fulfill and often exceed these targets.
They had to demonstrate diligence and ideological purity.
Which means the terror was a self-generating mechanism. The local NKVD wasn't hunting down pre-existing traitors. They were, in effect, manufacturing them to hit a metric.
That's the heart of the system. They were hunting down targets of convenience. People like the elderly, the disabled, or those already in prison, just to quickly fill the shooting quotas. Furthermore, the victims were disproportionately peasants and national minorities, particularly Soviet Poles,
Why them specifically?
because of Moscow's growing paranoia about external enemies. Soviet Poles were about 40 times more likely to die than the average Soviet citizen in these purges. This shows a transition from class-based killing to ethnic killing, disguised as counter-espionage against enemy nations like Poles, Latvians, and Finns.
It's just astonishing how dramatically different the scale of Nazi terror was during the same pre-war period. The systems were operating under completely different constraints.
Entirely different. In contrast, before 1939, Hitler's terror focused on intimidation and property seizure-like, the boycotts and the Aryanization of Jewish property that started in 1933. This terror aimed primarily to force emigration.
Not extermination.
Not yet. German Jews constituted less than 1% of the German population, and those who died before the war were a very small fraction fewer than 3% of the total Holocaust deaths. The physical, systematic extermination we associate with the regime had simply not yet been organized or implemented in Germany itself.
Which brings us to key insight number 2, which addresses the fundamental economic logic behind all this.
Right. The logic of autarky and internal versus external colonization. Both regimes aimed for imperial autarky self-sufficiency within a massive protected land empire, insulated from international trade or blockades.
But their methods were completely different. Stalin practiced internal colonization through collectivization. He was extracting resources, the food surplus from the peasantry, the internal colony, to fund this rapid, self-sustaining heavy industrialization.
And starvation, again, was the consequence, and often the weapon, required to achieve this central plan.
Hitler, on the other hand, required external conquest. Lebensraum.
Living space.
Yeah.
His entire economic and racial vision necessitated the violent destruction of the Soviet Union to seize its vast agrarian lands, especially Ukraine, and its resources. This expansion was designed to ensure German prosperity and military resilience at the expense of everyone else.
The economic planners were shockingly blunt about this, weren't they? They saw the conquest of Ukraine as the only realistic way to insulate Germans from a future British blockade and allow Germany to become a true global power.
Absolutely. The ideological premise was that Germany could only thrive by consuming the East, which meant the systematic destruction of millions of people who already lived on that land was a necessary precondition for Hitler's colonial agrarianism.
It was a planned redistribution of planetary resources.
In favor of the German Herrenvolk.
Yes. Which brings us to key insight 3, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which created a shared moment of killing between 1939 and 1941. This is the alliance between Hitler and Stalin that divided Poland and immediately brought mass death to the territories between them.
This was the moment the systems collided and, for a time, cooperated. For the Soviets, the immediate annexation of eastern Poland led to the rapid application of their coercive system. They targeted the newly annexed Polish elites and populations with established Soviet methods. First and foremost, massive deportations. About 315,000 Polish citizens were exiled to the Gulag, or special settlements in Siberia.
And the execution of the Polish elite became the symbol of the shared terror, specifically the Katyn Massacre.
The Katyn Massacre, carried out by the NKVD in 1940, saw 21,892 Polish officers and prisoners of war executed. This was the intellectual and military core of the Polish nation. They were taken to execution sites like Katyn, Katonin, and Kharkiv, and the procedure itself speaks to the bureaucratic nature of the murder.
How so?
They were shot with a single Nagin pistol bullet to the base of the skull, often in rooms soundproofed with sawdust or near running truck engines to mask the gunshots.
A clean, organized, bureaucratic elimination
Of an entire national leadership class, yes.
Meanwhile, the German actions in Western Poland were, they were perfectly parallel and complementary.
They were. The German Einsatzgruppen, the Special Task Forces, immediately targeted the Polish educated classes in what was known as Operation Tannenberg. Their mission was explicitly to destroy Poland as a functioning society by eliminating its upper levels, its intelligentsia. They killed an estimated 50,000 Polish civilians in actions that were completely disconnected from frontline combat.
The goal was just to render Poland incapable of resistance.
And to fulfill the German racist fantasy of the country as a non-nation, ripe for colonization.
Finally, we get to key insight 4, the transformation of mass murder after 1941. This is when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, shattering the alliance and making the Bloodlands the absolute central killing ground.
This invasion triggered a catastrophic shift. German policy went from that slow Aryanization and forced emigration in Germany to immediate widespread extermination in the East. And critically, the Molotov-Ribbentrop line, that dividing line they had drawn just 2 years prior, became the geographical determinant of the killing methods.
And this shift happened because the Germans had now occupied the territories most densely inhabited by Jews. We're talking about roughly 5 million people who now fell under the direct control of the Reich.
Precisely. East of the line in the recently annexed Soviet territories, the Holocaust began almost immediately with massive on-site mass shootings. Places like Kamianets-Podilsky and Babi Yar near Kiev saw the mass murder of tens of thousands of Jews by local shooting units and the Einsatzgruppen.
Babi Yar alone saw over 33,000 people killed in just 2 days.
In September 1941, yes. But the method was different west of the line in occupied Poland, which Germany had taken first.
West of the line, that's where the mass murder shifted to industrial gas facilities.
Those were the fixed death factories. Treblinka, Sobibor, Bierzek, and Chimno. They were designed primarily for the systematic gassing of non-working Polish Jews, often using carbon monoxide pumped from repurposed engines or Zyklon B.
And the difference was logistical.
It was logistical. Mass shootings were efficient in the massive open territories of the Soviet East. Fixed industrial centers were more efficient for the dense urban populations of occupied Poland. Now we can transition into mapping the actual institutional mechanisms, which is really the analytical core of Snyder's work.
Right.
Let's look first at the Stalinist state structures and resource control, what he calls the quota system.
At the heart of the Stalinist system was this devastating belief that the central plan superseded reality. Collectivization demanded complete state control of land and crops, primarily to extract resources for rapid heavy industry. It was a planned, accelerated attempt to drag a peasant nation into the industrial age, no matter the human cost.
And this control allowed for the weaponization of administration. We saw this most clearly in the starvation of 1933. This wasn't a famine caused by nature.
No.
It was enforced through seemingly neutral administrative requirements, return grain advances, meet impossible quotas. Officials knew these bureaucratic rules would result in millions of deaths.
As you mentioned, Stalin insisted the state fight ferociously to fulfill the plan.
Yes, the local Ukrainian Politburo was forced, by the structure of the centralized state, to affirm requisition targets in December 1932. That decision sealed the death sentence for 3 million people. The system demanded adherence to the plan over reality, making the administrative official the executioner.
That concept that a catastrophic outcome could be produced simply by enforcing a bureaucratic rule is terrifying. It moves the responsibility out of the hands of a single tyrant and into the anonymous machinery of the state.
And that allows countless individuals to participate without feeling individually morally culpable.
A diffusion of responsibility.
That diffusion of responsibility is precisely what makes the system so lethal. And we see the system refined into sheer bureaucratic terror during the Great Terror quotas. The NKVD did not randomly target victims.
No, Moscow issued numerical targets.
Like Order 00447, classifying people for shooting, or the Gulag. These were specific statistical goals. Killed 272,950 people, deport this many families.
So if the purpose of the Great Terror was to fill quotas, how did the system manage the contradiction of hunting counter-revolutionaries while also just generating them to meet a metric?
It was a perfect feedback loop of paranoia. Local NKVD units were compelled to find people to fill these quotas, to demonstrate their diligence, and crucially to prove they weren't themselves soft or saboteurs.
Which created an insatiable appetite for victims.
An insatiable appetite. They decided which Soviet citizens would still the targets, often the most vulnerable groups who were easiest to seize, such as those already in administrative custody.
And the results were often completely arbitrary, showing a total divorce from any actual ideological purpose beyond the internal logic of the quota system itself.
Absolutely. The record showed these absurd outcomes, like the shooting, not deportation, of 35 people in Leningrad who were deaf and mute, or the elderly in Soviet Ukraine, simply because it was logistically easier to kill them than to deport them, and the camps were already overflowing. The system prioritized administrative expediency.
And the execution facilities were meticulously organized for discretion.
Soundproof rooms, running truck engines. The anonymity of the death matched the anonymity of the bureaucratic classification that defined the victim as a quota filler.
Let's turn now to the mirror image, the Nazi state structures and ideological mechanisms, the war of annihilation.
Hitler's ideological goal required a self-sufficient German empire built on the agricultural wealth of the East. This required eliminating superfluous Slavic and Jewish populations. This goal was formalized into the Hunger Plan in 1941, before the invasion of the Soviet Union. This was a premeditated, bureaucratic plan to starve approximately 30 million Soviet citizens.
Specifically city dwellers in deficit regions like Russia and Belarus.
Yes, to redirect food to German soldiers and German civilians in Western Europe.
And the German planners, they laid out the moral calculus of mass murder with just clinical precision.
The architects of this plan, people like Herbert Back, Goering's food expert, they drafted guidelines stating, with absolute clarity, that any attempts to rescue the population from starvation by using food surpluses from Ukraine would prevent the possibility of Germany holding out until the end of the war.
So the survival of the German Empire was structurally dependent on the mass murder by starvation of tens of millions of Slavs.
It was not a side effect of war. It was institutionalized contempt for life made into policy.
And here is the frightening, chilling overlap. The German economic planners found the Soviet collective farm structure, the very structure that caused the Holodomor ideal for their purpose.
It was the perfect piece of weaponized inheritance. Back reputedly noted that they would have had to introduce the collective farm if the Soviets had not already arranged it. Stalin's centralized system, designed for internal extraction, was simply repurposed by the Nazis for maximum external extraction. It allowed the Germans to control all agrarian production and systematically starve the Soviet urban population.
It demonstrates the administrative compatibility of opposing tyrannies.
When the goal is ruthless resource control, yes.
And the mechanism of murder also underwent a rapid escalation. Initially, the German military had orders to kill captured political commissars, the Commissar Order, and to crack down on specific groups. But the scale just grew exponentially.
It did. The SS and Einsatzgruppen were initially designed to eliminate specific ideological and racial groups. But as the war progressed, Himmler and the SS demonstrated a grim logistical lesson. Shooting was easier than starvation, deportation, and slavery when military and logistical plans faltered.
It was more efficient.
Tragically, yes. And the shift was accelerated by the German military's profound, systems-level contempt for Slavic and Asian life. This was formalized in the astounding death rate for Soviet POWs. 57.5% death rate, compared to less than 5% for Western allies captured by the Germans. This systemic contempt, enforced through routine military administration, made mass starvation and mass shooting scalable.
This inherent systemic contempt brings us to the volatile middle ground, the feedback loops and the amplification of violence. How did the collision of the two systems amplify the atrocity?
Well, when the German invasion arrived in June 1941, it first encountered lands, the Baltics, eastern Poland, that had only recently been annexed by the Soviets. And here, the Germans found NKVD prisons full of fresh corpses. For example, 9,817 Polish citizens were shot by the NKVD in the summer of 1941 to prevent them from falling into German hands.
And that evidence of atrocity provided immediate, potent propaganda for the Nazis.
Potent Nazi propaganda exploitation. The Germans immediately used this evidence of Soviet mass murder to blame Jews for Soviet oppression, promoting the concept of Judeo-Bolshevism, the idea that communism was a Jewish conspiracy.
And this narrative fueled vicious local pogroms and collaboration.
In Lithuania, Ukraine, and Poland, violence became what Snyder calls a joint production, a Nazi edition of a Soviet text. In Lviv, where 2,500 prisoners were found dead in the NKVD prison, the Germans blamed Jews and killed thousands of local Jews in revenge pogroms. This psycho-Soviet repression, followed by Nazi exploitation and local collaboration, was defining system failure in the Bloodlands.
And finally, we see the catastrophic feedback loop where military failure leads directly to genocide.
Yes. When Operation Barbarossa stalled near Moscow in late 1941, the dream of a lightning victory and the massive colonial starvation plan, it failed. Hitler needed a victory, an affirmation of his genius in the face of military defeat. This psychological and political need triggered a reformulation of his war aims,
shifting the priority from colonial conquest to the physical extermination of the Jews.
the final solution as an ersatz victory, a symbolic substitute success. This confirmed that the elimination of Jews was, for Hitler, an end in itself, a necessary act to prove the ideological righteousness of the regime even when its military strategy collapsed.
Okay, let's unpack this. So what does this all mean for us today? These patterns of institutional violence don't just exist in history books. They reveal truths about how states manage narratives and populations. Let's look closely at modern memory politics and historical myth-making.
After 1945, the Soviet system controlled the narrative in the East. This necessitated the systematic erasure of Jewish suffering.
Why, though?
Because acknowledging the specificity of the Holocaust exposed two very inconvenient truths. First, the earlier Soviet collaboration with the Nazis, and second, the prevalence of non-Jewish local collaboration with the Germans during the killing phase.
So the victims had to be generalized. They had to be made anonymous in a different way.
Precisely. Victims were generalized as peaceful Soviet citizens. Monuments could not bear stars of David. They had to feature only 5-pointed red stars. The most famous example is the refusal to publish the Black Book of Soviet Jewry, a detailed collection of documents about the mass killing. This was a political decision to suppress Jewish history of the war, crucial for maintaining the myth of a united, ethnically harmonious Soviet population resisting fascism.
And this erasure coincided with a sweeping reconfiguration of the map, resulting in post-war ethnic homogeneity, a normalization of mass ethnic cleansing.
Snyder shows that Stalin's ultimate goal, paradoxically, was a Soviet multinational empire surrounded by ethnically homogeneous satellites, a Poland for Poles, a post-war Czechoslovakia for Czechs. This required massive forced population transfers, including the expulsion of an estimated 7.6 million Germans from newly acquired Polish territory.
What's so striking is how widely accepted this violence was.
It was. Even democratic allies like the US and UK accepted these expulsions. Churchill called population transfers a clean sweep, and President Hoover called it a heroic remedy. The brutal legacy of ethnic cleansing became normalized as a path to post-war stability, a deeply troubling systemic lesson.
And anti-Semitism, as an ideological tool, remained available for the communist regimes, even those that had suffered under Hitler.
It provided a convenient, flexible scapegoat. In the late 40s and early 50s, Soviet public life verged toward anti-Semitism, culminating in the 1953 Doctor's Plot, where Stalin fabricated a conspiracy linking Jewish nationalism with medical murder to justify a potential purge.
And later in Poland?
Later, in Communist Poland in 1968, Polish communists weaponized the Nazi stereotype of Judeo-Bolshevism, blaming Stalinism's past excesses on its supposed Jewishness to create an ethnically Polish version of communism. It shows how even after one tyranny is defeated, the bureaucratic language of prejudice remains available for state control.
Moving on to state violence and bureaucratic killing, the book is a masterclass in how administrative systems transform living, breathing people into superfluous entities, dead on paper before they are physically dead.
And the contrast between the quick, anonymous death like the officer shot upon arrival at K dinner in the gas chambers at Treblinka, and the slow, dehumanizing alienation of the labor camps at Auschwitz. It reveals the different strains of bureaucratic killing, but the underlying mechanism is the same. In the Stalinist system, the kulak was administratively defined as an enemy of the plan. In the Nazi system, the Jew was defined by racial classification.
Let's ground this in a specific, harrowing detail. The story about Dina Pranicheva at Babi Yar illustrates how these identity classifications, often created for benign administrative purposes, became instruments of mass murder.
Dina Pranicheva was one of the very few survivors of the Babi Yar massacre near Kyiv in 1941. The bureaucratic process was ruthless. People were required to strip naked, surrender valuables and documents, and then lie down on top of previously killed corpses before being shot.
The killing process was so rapid. 33,761 people in just 2 days.
And the German police were simply reading Soviet identity documents, the internal passports, which specified Jewish nationality, or they were physically inspecting men's bodies.
So a classification established for Soviet administration
Was immediately repurposed into lethal criteria by the Gestapo, which often set up shop in former NKVD offices.
Yeah.
The system was interchangeable.
That transition, where the same administrative infrastructure is used by two opposing tyrannies, is profoundly disturbing, and it leads directly into the analysis of moral distance and collaboration.
The book shows that collaboration was rarely driven purely by ideology. It was often driven by material interests, the desire for self-preservation, or just coercion. The Bloodlands were a place of pervasive moral contamination.
And Snyder provides some grim examples of the complexity of collaboration in these annexed territories.
In the lands east of the Molotov-Ribbentrop line, which had just experienced years of Soviet terror, many collaborators were simply shifting allegiance. They had served the Soviets, sometimes as NKVD militiamen, and now shifted to German police units, often seeking to cleanse themselves of prior Soviet associations by killing Jews, whom the Nazis had conveniently linked to Bolshevism.
It's this perverse logic of survival.
It is.
Yeah.
German officers noted that their economic planners found the existing Soviet collective farm structure ideal for the hunger plan. German soldiers marching toward Stalingrad passed by Treblinka and chose to know what they were fighting for. The system compelled people to act without true moral safety, ensuring they became complicit before they might themselves be consumed by the next round of purges. We can now situate this historical deep dive within the broader framework of crisis in perception. Bloodlands offers a powerful argument for examining systems versus individual blame.
The book effectively demolishes the simplified, often comforting idea that mass killing is solely the result of uniquely evil leaders or a few psychopaths. It shows how the structure of the one-party state inverted the meaning of party. It was no longer a competing group, but the group that determined the rules of life and death, and it diffused responsibility for lethal outcomes.
And the system compelled action, regardless of personal background or ethnicity. The fact that the NKVD officer executing his Polish comrades could be of Polish, Jewish, or Russian nationality, or that Jewish NKVD officers implemented national killing campaigns against Poles, it demonstrates how deeply the system compelled action, regardless of individual moral inclination.
Mass murder became a bureaucratic necessity.
Because economic planning in both regimes structurally required the exclusion or elimination of superfluous groups to achieve ideological success.
Secondly, the book explores how ideology masks material incentives. The narratives of utopia served a very concrete purpose.
Both Stalin's socialism and Hitler's racial empire were utopian visions tied fundamentally to the control of territory and resources, specifically food, oil, and mineral wealth. Stalin promised a workers' paradise, justifying starvation as a defense against the imagined kulak saboteur. Hitler promised a 1,000-year Reich, justifying genocide as a defense against international Jewry.
So ideology was the big lie that concealed policy failure.
Exactly. When the communist plan stalled, blame the internal enemy. When the Nazi war stalled, eliminate the external enemy. Dead human beings became retrospective arguments for the rectitude of a failing policy.
And finally, the essential theme: how bureaucratic processes normalize violence.
The transition from the political elimination of rivals to the mass killing of anonymous people defined by quotas in the NKVD or classifications, Jews, Soviet POWs, demonstrates this normalization perfectly. The German decision to prioritize the starvation of Soviet POWs, leading to that 57.5% death rate compared to the few percent for Western allies, was a systems-level contempt for life rooted in racial ideology, carried out through routine military administration.
And the most efficient killing was often the most anonymous.
Simply classifying a person as superfluous through a passport entry or a quota, and then delivering them to a disposal site optimized for mass efficiency.
In reflection, what Bloodlands helps us see differently is that mass violence is not a series of isolated tragedies rooted only in irrational hatred. It's the overlapping result of two systems that, in pursuit of their respective violently enforced utopias, relied on massive, purposeful, administrative killing. It forces you to look beyond the individual monster and examine the monster's machine.
It reminds us that genocide is often a logistical and administrative challenge first and foremost. The fact that the German SS found the existing Soviet collective farm structure ideal for their hunger plan, or that the Gestapo used Soviet internal passports to determine Jewish identity at Babi Yar, it shows that the bureaucratic DNA of tyranny is deeply interconnected and adaptable.
And this is why comparison matters. By comparing the Nazi and Soviet systems, we can lift the veil on their common inhumanity, rocked during to perfing on their common inhumanity. We see the shared political logic of tyranny, bring about a catastrophe through ideological policies, blame an invented enemy for the ensuing chaos, and use mass death as an ersatz victory when real military or economic success fails.
And the final reflective task Snyder sets for us is to resist the regime's tendency to turn living people into mere numbers. We must try to comprehend the scale: 14 million victims, while never ever forgetting the individuals the system sought to erase. We have to remember the Polish officer Adam Solski, whose final diary entry was cut short by the bullet at Katyn. They asked about my wedding ring, or the young Jewish girl Janita Vishnetskaya, whose last known line to her father was, "Farewell forever, I kiss you, I kiss you."
The enduring power of Snyder's work lies in this challenge. If we fail to turn the numbers back into people, if we fail to see the humanity erased by these administrative systems, then Hitler and Stalin have shaped not only our world but our humanity, and their lethal system of indifference continues to win. We have been deep diving into the essential work, Bloodlands: Europe Between Hitler and Stalin by Timothy Snyder. We strongly encourage you to read the book yourself. If you found the ideas valuable, please support the author, or check your local library for free access. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.